Guys, I apologize for the noise. I'm filming this in the middle of a construction zone. And most of you know exactly where I'm at. You see the Owens Corning building right in front of me, the high-level bridge behind it. The Mud Hens Stadium is just up the street there. Below me is Swan Creek going out into the river. And then just on the north side here, you can see it through the trees, is a building you've all seen before and probably never thought about, called Ford Industry Square. Close to this location right here was a post built by French traders in the middle 1600s. They used it through the 1700s. When we think of major influences on American history, we typically don't think about the French in America, much less here in Toledo. But right here, you had an important French trading post in a place most of you have walked around before. So join me today from Swan Creek as we take a look into French and Dutch America. Hi again, everybody. Hope you are doing well. This is going to be a quick review through other European settlement patterns. We have already covered the Spanish settlement pattern from Columbus onward, and today we're going to look at the French and the Dutch. Obviously that means we're leaving one major European power out. Oh, and I promise we'll come to the English soon. So without further delay, let's talk about the French and Dutch settlement patterns. Yeah, let's do that. Okay. Nouvelle France. I don't know. I'm hoping to learn if I have any of you who are taking French right now, because I am terrible at the French language, but I love it. I took a lot of German in high school and college and got fairly proficient in that. And then I've tried to teach myself French over the years, and my French is mauvais. So, Nouvelle France. New France. Nouvelle is new. France is France. 1534 is kind of what we date this back to. An explorer named Jacques Cartier claimed northern North America, and especially the areas along the St. Lawrence River as New France, as Nouvelle France. And the St. Lawrence River, for those of you who don't know, if you chose to walk up to Lake Erie right now and spit into the lake, which we don't do because of COVID, if you spit in the lake, eventually your spit would end up in the St. Lawrence River and going out to the Atlantic Ocean. The St. Lawrence River is what drains the Great Lakes. And since the Maumee River flows into Lake Erie, and Lake Erie flows into Lake Ontario, which flows into the St. Lawrence River, anything we do in the Maumee River essentially ends up becoming a problem for the St. Lawrence River later on. And we'll look at a map to understand that a little bit better later. Okay, so the St. Lawrence River. French fishermen sail up the river, they fish, they make alliances with the different Native American nations through there. One of the things that they realize as they're fishing and they get further up the river is that there are fur-bearing animals all over the place. And you are like, who cares? Okay, people did then. What we're talking about here are things like rabbit and mink and beaver and all the other kind of small to mid-sized mammals that you will find all along the Great Lakes and that we find in our yards often around here. As they find these animals, they are shocked, not because they've never seen them before, but because those animals have been nearly killed off in Europe. Europe has been undergoing, in the 16th century, a huge population boom. People are spreading out across the land. There's less wild land left. They're killing off a lot of the native species. And fur is in high demand in Europe because it's a northern climate, right? And the amount of fur-bearing animals has gone down. And these French fishermen and explorers start realizing this New France is a great source of fur-bearing animals. And so as they're making alliances with these Native American nations along the St. Lawrence River and moving inland, they start saying, hey, if you guys kill me a beaver, I will give you, whatever goods in return. And they start building a trade pattern based on the trade of furs for money and goods from Europe, mostly goods. Between 1598 and 1613, so at the dawn of the 17th century, a bunch of small settlements of French folk are built along the Atlantic coast of Canada in a region that we call Acadia today. And up in Maine, there is an Acadia National Park that I am told is a beautiful place. I would love to get there someday. And the folks there are called Acadians or Acadienne. And we'll come back to them in a little bit. So here's that map. All right. So you see the St. Lawrence River is up here, right? There's Newfoundland, which is disputed between France and England. And then the St. Lawrence River comes all the way up here. There's Lake Ontario. Here's Lake Erie. Right underneath Fort Detroit is Toledo, Ohio. And there's your other lakes. Where did my thing go? There we go. Lake Huron, Lake Superior, Lake Michigan. Chicago's over here. St. Louis is down here. Columbus, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh. So you kind of get a picture of where everything is here. Look at the territory that the French are taking, okay? And compare it to the Spanish pattern of settlement, and then compare it to the British pattern of settlement. And one of the things that I hope you're noticing here, if I ask you a very simple question, which country has claimed the most land? Hopefully you will see that the most claim was New Spain. The Spanish cared about controlling a lot of territory. They wanted to plunder the resources out of that territory. If I ask you who has about the second most land, well, it's maybe a tie between the British and the French. But you notice the British have kind of consolidated exactly the places that they want to have. And mostly it's in those 13 American colonies along the eastern seaboard and stopping at the ridge of the Appalachian Mountains, which becomes a really important plot point later. What you'll notice about the Canadians is that other than Acadia, they are basically trying to control land along a river. They are very much staying close to coasts. You've got the Door Peninsula up here in Wisconsin. You've got this area along the Illinois River coming down to the Mississippi River, and then starting at the Mississippi River down here and moving up. So they're not trying to control the oceans and the seaboards. They're trying to control the internal waterways, okay? Up here at Hudson's Bay, all along the Great Lakes, all along the Mississippi River. The French care about kind of controlling the rivers that allow you access to all of this area in the middle of the North American continent. The Spaniards care about the South. The British care about the Atlantic coast. And the French are the only ones really worried about the inland of what will become America and Canada. So we get Samuel de Champlain. And in 1608, Champlain founds Quebec City, which, again, I'm told, I haven't been there, is supposed to be one of the most beautiful cities in North America. He founds Quebec City and forms alliances with a bunch of different Native American nations, including the Algonquin and the Huron. And these two nations had long-standing beef with the Iroquois. And if you remember from our pre-Columbian lecture, we said the Iroquois really dominated upstate New York, and Iroquoian people came all the way along the southern part of the Great Lakes. Well, there were other Native American nations that were not fans of these guys. And again, this speaks to the complexity of Native American nations. We all know that the British and the French spent most of modern history hating each other. And this is no different. That's Native Europeans who don't like each other. And over here in the Americas, you have different nations that don't like each other either. So, as Champlain and these other voyageurs kind of become close with the Algonquin and the Huron, they send out these guys called coureurs de bois. And I'm sure I slaughtered the pronunciation of that. I can't even pronounce English. Can't even pronounce pronounced. But the coureurs de bois are like runners of the forest. And these were young guys who were supposed to go out into the wilderness, into the hinterland, live among the Huron, learn their language, and learn their customs. I will ask you to remember that because we want to contrast that with how the Spanish did business and especially how the English did business. The French were interested in learning the native nations' customs, learning their language. Then you have the Jesuits. The Jesuit missionaries are encouraged to explore inland on the Great Lakes. And a lot of places, when we look around, Michigan and Wisconsin and Illinois and Minnesota, these are places that were explored not by warriors, but by priests. Now, you can always make the argument that the Jesuits are indeed the warrior priests of the Catholic Church, and the Jesuits are really, really, really interesting historically. But the Jesuits go out and they really do some amazing work in cartography, map making, in linguistics, in cultural studies. There are dark sides to that as well, as they are converting people from their native religions and not always doing it peacefully. But by and large, the Jesuits really do a really interesting job as they move inland. Establishment of government. How do the French establish government in these Nouvelle France? In 1665, Louis XIV sends French troops, and he forms a government in New France that answers to him. And by 1672, they double the population of New France. Louis XIV is the first French leader to really look at New France as something that should be populated and controlled. Now, just a little point of interest here. My wife's family, her descendants, my wife is descendant from one of these troops that Louis XIV sent in the 1660s to what is today Montreal. And so my wife has been in this country a whole lot longer than I have. Her family's been here a whole lot longer than my people, who barely made it here in time for the First World War. So the population doubles by 1672, and they're really only sending guys. They're sending a bunch of soldiers. And the French government encouraged intermarriage with the natives. Again, contrast this to the Spanish pattern. In the Spanish pattern, anybody who intermarries with a native, their children are like a rung down in society. The French are encouraging intermarriage, not just because they don't want a bunch of lonely dudes running around the North American continent, but because they believe this is a way to like strengthen alliances. By the 1700s, the French start building forts and settlements. They build them in today's Louisiana, going up the Mississippi River towards St. Louis, towards Pittsburgh, along the Ohio River, Sandusky, Ohio. There are lots of places where the French established forts and settlements. Their economy is based on the idea that we have to have good relations with the inland tribes. The trade has to be mostly fair. Does this mean that Native Americans are getting a fair shake every time? Absolutely not. But are they getting a more fair deal than the Spanish gave Native American tribes, than the English will give American tribes? Absolutely. The French really, again, I'm not saying they did great. They still had many atrocities that took place with Native Americans, but compared to the British, compared to the Spanish, the French pattern of settlement is less bad than the others. And what are they getting in return? The steady supply of furs that can be traded back in England. What did the natives receive? Weapons, which are going to change the nature of their warfare. Alcohol, which is going to change the nature of their society. Finished goods, things made out of metal, things made out of clay, things made out of wood, cloth. They're going to get finished goods that hadn't been previously available in any kind of supply for Native Americans. Conflicts. Most of the conflicts at this time are the French and the Huron versus the Iroquois. There are lots of small battles, lots of fairly major wars that break out, and a lot of them are the French teamed up with the Huron against the Iroquois. And in 1688, there's a really marked change in this, and it's an important change. And that's that the Iroquois team up with the Brits. The Iroquois look at the Huron with their European friend, and the Iroquois decide, we need a European friend too. As they team up, sporadic fighting is going to continue pretty much from 1688 right on through the middle of the 1700s between the British and their Indian allies and the French and their Indian allies. And this is, again, a really important plot point as we try to understand what's going to happen to create the United States. Where were they? As we talked about earlier, and you saw this map earlier, the French are in a lot of different places. And I think if we just look state by state at the different places that the French are, by the time we get to American independence, much less later when they go into many other places, the French control parts of Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Indiana, Missouri, Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Louisiana, Texas, Kansas, for goodness sakes. And then soon after this, with what we will call the Louisiana Purchase, the French are going to take control of parts of Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, the Dakotas, Nebraska. It's just kind of stunning, really, how much of what's today the United States at one point or another was part of France. And we so often think about this nation's English heritage, and in the Southwest, they often think about the nation's Spanish heritage, and seldom do we think about the French heritage of so many parts of our country. Here in Ohio, one of those coureurs de bois is a guy named Etienne Brulé. And Etienne Brulé is the first person to map the Maumee River Valley. So basically from Toledo, where the Maumee empties into the Lake Erie, all the way back to Fort Wayne. And then Brulé makes his way up a little bit on the St. Joe and St. Mary's watersheds at Fort Wayne, where the Maumee River starts. Our area of Ohio was all French until the 1740s. And there were French trading posts throughout. One of them was at a place called Roche de Boeuf at Waterville. And if you've ever been to Waterville in the Metro Park there, Farnsworth Metro Park, there's a crazy old bridge that's fallen apart that goes across the Maumee River, and part of that bridge is supported by a big island in the middle. And that big island in the middle is Roche de Boeuf, or Roche de Boot, depending on kind of, when I was a kid, it was always Roche de Boeuf, and today people are transliterating it Roche de Boot, whichever. It was an important settlement, an important trading post, and it had a lot of cultural significance to the folks who lived around here. In Toledo, one of the really interesting French settlements was at the very north part of the east side. So if you guys know where that huge crane was this last year, building that new steel plant up there, that's close to what is or was Presqu'Île. And Presqu'Île is basically where all those docks are at the end of the river on the east side. And that was home to a bunch of French families. There were Drouillards, who some of the Drouillards have changed their name, anglicized to Drouillard. So a lot of times if you meet somebody in Toledo with the last name of Drouillard, they're probably descendant of the Drouillards. Menards, just like save big money at Menards. And many of the Menards changed their last name to Manor, M-A-N-O-R. And when you meet people whose families have been in Northwest Ohio for a long time, and their last name is Manor, there's a good chance they were Menards. Lapointes, there are a lot of Lapointes around Toledo. Navars, I think you guys are probably aware that that our former Toledo police chief was Mike Navarre. You've heard of Peter Navarre. Navarre family was a big French family around here. Jacobs, there are lots of Jacobses around Toledo. Cavalier, there used to be a big Cavalier Realty company in Toledo. Couture, especially on the east side. And if you go out towards Bono and out towards Port Clinton, there are lots of people with last name of Couture or Couture, and a lot of them trace their ancestry back to Presqu'Île and the French families that settled this part of Ohio. Okay, moving on from France, we go to the Dutch. And this is where things get confusing. You talk about stuff like We never teach this in school. And instead, we just get to be confused until we're adults. And I was the same way. I was like, Holland, Netherlands, Dutch, these must be 3 different things. They're not. I never understood that before. So Holland is part of the Netherlands. There's like a dozen provinces in the Netherlands, and one of them is like North Holland, one of them South Holland, but Holland is part of the Netherlands. And then there's other provinces like Limburg and stuff. Holland is part of the Netherlands. People from the Netherlands are Dutch. Dutch is the name for the people of the Netherlands. Americans are from the United States. Dutch are from the Netherlands. So when you hear people say Holland, what they mean is the Netherlands. They're probably not talking about somebody specifically from those 2 provinces. They're talking about anybody from the Netherlands when they talk about Dutch, or when they talk about Holland most of the time. This whole country that I've got a map of here, and I have been here twice. I love the Netherlands. And this place down here, Maastricht, if I ever disappear off the grid, I'm probably in Maastricht. I love Maastricht. It's one of my favorite places I've ever been in the world. But this whole country, from Amsterdam, which you've heard of, to The Hague, which you've maybe heard of, and Rotterdam, which you've possibly heard of, this whole country is 1/3 the size of Ohio. All right? Take 3 Netherlands and put them together and you get Ohio. So it's kind of like, if you can imagine, basically from Northwest Ohio over to Cleveland and halfway down to Columbus, like to Mansfield or Marion. And that's basically how big the Netherlands is. It's not a huge country, but it is a country that had a huge impact. So the story of the Dutch colonies begins around 1610. And a sailor named Henry Hudson gets across the Atlantic, and he explores the areas around present-day New York City. And he goes up a river that we today call the Hudson River, which makes up one of the borders of New York City. He establishes a place called New Netherland all around the areas that he has discovered. And he, at first, claims, kind of optimistically, he claims all the land between the British Virginia Company all the way in the south and New France up in Canada. 14 years later, they establish a city called New Amsterdam, and New Amsterdam is exactly where Manhattan in New York City is today. Manhattan Island in New York City is New Amsterdam. The Dutch trade with the Native Americans. They are not the most fair traders in the world, but they are a little better than the English and a little better than the Spanish. And probably not as favorable as the French. They are exporting fur the same as the French, but they are also realizing that finance can be a central industry. So the Dutch are setting up a banking system in New York. And this is kind of the beginning as they're financing different adventures going inland. This is kind of the beginning of New York becoming the finance capital of the United States, which it remains to this day. Washington, D.C. is the political capital, but that ain't where the stock market is. That's in New York. The other thing that's really important to understand about New Amsterdam is that it was kind of a real mishmash of people. There were lots of different religions, lots of different ethnicities. And while there was an official church for the Netherlands, and there was technically an official church in New Amsterdam, they kind of had a live and let live policy with other religions. And so New York, from the very beginning, more than almost any other city in America, truly was a melting pot or a salad bowl with lots and lots of different people who lived pretty peacefully next to each other. That included free black people. There were free African Americans in New Amsterdam. However, one of the things to understand here is that the Dutch were big in the slavery business. Now, did that mean there were a lot of enslaved people in New York? Not really. There were enslaved people in New York, but not in great numbers like the Dutch had in their Caribbean holdings. And these are places that are today islands like Aruba, Curacao, and St. Martin. Over the next 40 years, between the 1620s and the 1660s, The Dutch start losing a little bit of territory at the north, a little bit of territory at the south, a little bit of territory in the west, a little bit of territory here. Their new Netherland keeps shrinking. And then finally in 1664, the British sail some warships up, make some demands, and England claims New Amsterdam. And rather than calling it New Amsterdam, they call it New York. Okay? The Dutch retain colonies in the New World, but none in what will be the United States. So even to this day, if you go to Aruba, Curacao, St. Martin, those islands down in the Caribbean are still administered by the Dutch government to this day. So that's kind of the story of the Dutch colonies. I hope this was somewhat informative to you, if not entertaining, and gave you a little understanding of the French and Dutch patterns of settlement. We will be getting to the big one, the English pattern of settlement, in our next unit, where we spend a lot of time on English American colonies. So you guys have a great day. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.